I never intended to be a detective. I was just a nurse, a person paid to change sheets, administer fluids, and offer a comforting hand to those waiting for the end. But the end wasn't coming for Arthur Sterling. Something else was waiting for him. Something far more sinister than death. It was a Tuesday, the kind of rainy gray afternoon that makes the fluorescent lights of the nursing home feel like an interrogation room. The air in room 304 always smelled of lavender and decay, a masking scent used to cover the smell of a life slowly withering away. Arthur was in the armchair by the window, his back to me. He was staring at the rain, his head lolling slightly to the left, his posture that of a man whose strings had been cut. He was the model patient for the dementia ward. Silent, vacant, compliant. Or so we all thought. I needed to change his bedding. It was routine, mundane. I walked over to the bed, the plastic soles of my shoes squeaking against the linoleum. I pulled back the heavy woolen blanket, then the top sheet. The mattress protector had slipped, bunching up near the headboard. I sighed, reaching down to lift the heavy corner of the mattress to straighten it out. That was the moment my entire world shifted axis. As I lifted the heavy foam, a cascade of blue rattled against the bed frame. It wasn't dust, and it wasn't lint. It was a horde. Hundreds of small, oval-shaped blue pills spilled out from a hollowed-out section of the foam, cascading onto the floor like a waterfall of toxic rain. I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it would crack them. I knew these pills. Quetiapine, strong sedatives, antipsychotics, the maximum dose prescribed by Dr. Vance to manage Arthur's violent outbursts and severe cognitive decline. Every night at 8 p.m. for the last 6 months, I had watched him put these pills in his mouth. I had watched him swallow. I had checked his mouth. Or at least I thought I had. I stared at the pile. There were months' worth of medication here, enough to sedate an elephant, enough to kill a man if taken at once. But he hadn't taken them. Not a single one. A cold shiver violently ran down my spine, not from the drafty window, but from the sudden, terrifying realization of what this meant. If he wasn't taking the medication, then the man sitting in that chair wasn't a vegetable. He wasn't lost in the fog of dementia. He was here. He was present. And he had been watching us the entire time. I slowly turned my head toward the armchair, terror gripping my throat. Arthur was no longer looking at the rain. He had rotated the chair. He was facing me. His head wasn't lolling. His posture was upright, rigid, military, and his eyes. God, his eyes. The milky vacancy was gone. In its place was a gaze of steel, sharp as a razor, burning with an intelligence and a rage that made my knees buckle. He raised a single trembling finger to his lips. "Shh," he whispered, the sound cutting through the hum of the medical equipment like a gunshot. I dropped the corner of the mattress. The sound of the bed hitting the frame seemed deafening, but the thunder outside masked it. I couldn't breathe. I looked at the door, then back at him. He had already slumped back into his previous position, the transformation instantaneous. In a blink, the sharp, calculating man was gone, replaced once again by the drooling, vacant shell of Arthur Sterling, the former steel tycoon who had allegedly lost his mind after his wife's death. But I knew what I had seen. The image of those sharp blue eyes was burned into my retinas. I quickly fell to my knees, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I began to scoop the blue pills back under the mattress. I couldn't leave them on the floor. If Dr. Vance saw this, or worse, if his son Richard saw this, I didn't know what would happen, but my gut told me it would be dangerous. I shoved the hoard back into the hollowed-out foam, smoothing the sheets with frantic, sweaty palms. My mind was racing, replaying the last 6 months. Arthur Sterling, 78 years old. Admitted by his son, Richard, with a diagnosis of rapid-onset aggressive dementia. He was one of the wealthiest men in the state, yet he was left here in this high-end facility that felt more like a prison wrapped in velvet. I remembered the day he arrived. He was strapped to a gurney, screaming that they were stealing his life. Richard had stood there, adjusting his expensive Italian suit, looking at his father with a mix of pity and annoyance. "He's gone, nurse," Richard had told me, handing over a thick file. "The man who built Sterling Industries is dead. This is just what's left." And I believed him. We all did. Because that's what we are trained to do. We trust the charts. We trust the doctors. We trust the grieving families. I looked at Arthur now. He was picking at a loose thread on his pajama pants, humming a discordant, broken tune. It was a perfect performance. Too perfect. I finished the bed and moved to the window, pretending to adjust the blinds. I needed to see his face again. "Mr. Sterling," I asked softly, my voice trembling. "Are you comfortable?" He didn't answer. He didn't even blink. He just kept picking at the thread. But as I leaned in to check his pulse, an excuse to be close to him, I felt his hand brush against mine. It wasn't an accident. His grip tightened on my wrist for a fraction of a second. It was a firm, desperate squeeze. A signal. Then he let go, his hand flopping back onto his lap like a dead fish. My heart broke for him in that instant. I didn't know why he was doing this, why he was subjecting himself to the humiliation of diapers, spoon-feeding, and the pitying stares of staff, but I knew the cost. To pretend to be dead while you are still alive requires a strength I couldn't fathom, or a fear so great it eclipses dignity. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of paranoia. Every time I passed the nurse's station, I felt like everyone knew. I felt like the cameras in the hallway were zooming in on my sweating forehead. I tried to act normal, administering meds to the other residents, but my mind remained in room 304. I began to notice things I had ignored before, small discrepancies that had slipped through the cracks of my exhaustion. The way Dr. Vance always personally checked on Arthur, not with a stethoscope, but with a quick, searching glance, as if making sure the prisoner was still secure. The way Arthur's son, Richard, never visited on weekends, only on Tuesdays and Thursdays, always accompanied by a lawyer who carried a briefcase that looked heavy enough to hold gold bars. At 6 p.m., I went back to give Arthur his dinner. Pureed carrots and roast beef. The soft diet, mandated for patients who supposedly had trouble swallowing. As I fed him, spoon by humiliating spoon, I saw the rage behind his eyes again. It was fleeting, hidden behind a mask of confusion, but it was there. He swallowed the mush with difficulty. He hated it. He hated me for doing this to him. "I'm sorry, Arthur," I whispered, barely moving my lips. "I didn't know." He paused mid-chew. His eyes flicked to the door, checking the small glass window. Seeing it was clear, he looked back at me. He didn't speak, but he did something that chilled me to the bone. He slowly moved his hand to the tray and used his index finger to trace a shape in the spilled carrot puree on the plastic table. It wasn't a scribble. It was deliberate. A circle. Then a line through it. Then the letter R. He wiped it away instantly as footsteps approached the door. The door swung open, and Dr. Vance walked in, smelling of expensive cologne and antiseptic. "How is our star patient today, Elena?" he asked, his voice smooth, too oily for a doctor in a place like this. He walked over to Arthur, placing a hand on the old man's shoulder. Arthur flinched. It was a subtle movement, a recoil, like an animal sensing a predator. "He's quiet," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Ate all his dinner." Dr. Vance smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He looked at the empty tray, then at Arthur. "Good. We need him strong. Richard is coming tomorrow for a very important meeting. The family needs closure on some administrative matters." He squeezed Arthur's shoulder, hard. I saw Arthur's knuckles turn white as he gripped the armrests, but his face remained slack, his mouth slightly open. "Make sure he gets his full dose tonight, Elena," Vance said, his eyes locking onto mine. "Double-check it. He's been restless at night, according to the night shift. We can't have him agitated tomorrow." Richard needs him calm. Of course, doctor, I replied. As Vance left, the room felt colder. Administrative matters. Richard needs him calm. The pieces were starting to click together, forming a picture that made my stomach turn. They weren't treating him. They were managing him. They were keeping him sedated to keep him compliant. But for what? What could a man diagnosed with end-stage dementia possibly sign or agree to? Unless the diagnosis was the lie. Unless the dementia was the prison they built to keep him from fighting back. Arthur looked at me again. This time he didn't signal to be quiet. He looked at the door where the doctor had exited, then at the tray, and then at me. His lips moved, barely a breath of sound, but in the silence of the room, I heard it perfectly. Poison, he whispered. They want the signature. The mystery wasn't just about the pills anymore. It was a countdown. Whatever was happening tomorrow with Richard and the lawyer, it was the endgame. Arthur had been hoarding the pills to keep his mind clear for this moment, whatever it was. He was fighting a war from a hospital bed, surrounded by enemies, and I was the only neutral party who had stumbled onto the battlefield. I looked at the hidden stash under the mattress in my mind's eye. He was vulnerable. If I gave him the double dose tonight as ordered, he would be out cold tomorrow. He would be exactly what they wanted him to be. But if I didn't, if I faked the log, I would be risking my license, my job, and maybe my safety. I looked at Arthur, the man who had built an empire, now reduced to begging with his eyes. I realized then that the dementia ward was just a waiting room for a crime that was about to take place. And I held the key. The hours between the doctor's exit and the end of my shift stretched out like a lifetime. The hospital wing settled into its nightly rhythm, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, the soft squeak of rubber soles on tiled floors, the distant muffled coughing of patients who would likely never go home. But in room 304, the air was thick with a static charge that made the hair on my arms stand up. I sat in the corner, ostensibly filling out paperwork, but my eyes never left Arthur. He was still in bed, lying perfectly still, playing the part of the vacant invalid to perfection whenever a support staff member walked past the open door. But the moment the hallway was clear, his posture would shift, just incrementally, and his eyes would find mine in the reflection of the darkened window. We were co-conspirators now, bound by a secret that felt heavy enough to crush us both. I had to make a choice about the medication. The order on the chart was clear. Double dose. 8:00 p.m. Patient must be sedated for morning evaluation. Dr. Vance's signature was a jagged scrawl of authority at the bottom. If I followed the order, Arthur would be a zombie tomorrow when his son arrived. He would be unable to defend himself, unable to think, unable to resist whatever administrative matter was about to take place. If I didn't follow the order, and Arthur acted out or showed lucidity, Vance would know. He would know I had skipped the dose. He would check the logs. He would check the inventory. I would be fired, stripped of my license, and escorted out by security before I could say a word. At 7:55 p.m., I walked to the medication cart. My hands were trembling so badly I dropped the plastic cup twice. I looked around. The hallway was empty. The night shift supervisor, Mrs. Gable, was busy with an admission in the East Wing. I took the bottle of quetiapine. I popped the safety cap. The sound seemed to echo like a gunshot. I poured the 2 pills into the cup. Then, with a heart rate that must have been over 120, I took a tissue from my pocket, tipped the pills into it, crushed them into powder inside the tissue, and shoved the wad deep into my pocket. I filled the cup with a placebo, 2 sugar pills we used for hypochondriacs in the general ward. They looked identical. Blue, oval, harmless. I walked into room 304. "Time for your medicine, Mr. Sterling," I said loudly, for the benefit of the hallway microphones. I approached the bed. Arthur looked up at me. His face was a mask of confusion, his mouth hanging slightly open. He was committed to the role. I leaned in close, blocking the camera's view with my body. "It's sugar," I whispered, barely a breath. Stay sharp. Arthur's eyes didn't change, but his hand moved under the sheet, tapping his thigh twice. Acknowledgement. I put the pills in his mouth. He swallowed them with a grimace, then opened his mouth to show me it was empty, the standard protocol. I nodded, checked the box on his chart, and walked out. I went to the staff bathroom and flushed the crushed powder down the toilet, watching the white dust swirl away into the dark water. I felt sick. I had just falsified medical records. I had just disobeyed a direct order from the medical director. I was officially a rogue element. The night dragged on. I couldn't leave him. My shift ended at 9:00 p.m., but I invented a reason to stay, telling the night nurse, Sarah, that I needed to catch up on some overdue charting for the state inspection. She didn't care. It meant less work for her. By 11:00 p.m., the facility was a tomb. I crept back into room 304. The door was cracked open just an inch. Arthur was sitting up in bed, illuminated only by the pale moonlight filtering through the blinds. He looked like a ghost of the titan he once was. He wasn't sleeping. He was writing. He had a small, tattered notebook resting on his knees, the same notebook I had seen him hide under his pillow weeks ago, thinking it was just the hoarding behavior of a confused mind. I realized now it was a war log. I stepped inside and closed the door softly. He didn't jump. He knew I was there. "You risked everything tonight, Elena," he said. His voice was raspy from disuse, but it was strong, deep, authoritative. It was the voice of a man who had commanded boardrooms and negotiated mergers. Why? I walked to the foot of the bed, crossing my arms to stop them from shaking. "Because I saw your eyes," I said honestly. "And because I know a bully when I see one. Dr. Vance isn't treating you. He's keeping you." Arthur let out a dry, bitter chuckle. "Keeping me." "Yes, like a vintage car in a garage, waiting to be sold for parts." He closed the notebook and looked at me with an intensity that made me want to look away. "My son, Richard. He's not just coming for a signature tomorrow. He's coming for the kill, not my life. He doesn't have the stomach for murder, not directly. He's coming for the sterling trust. The legacy took me 50 years to build. He's gambled away his own inheritance, and now he needs the core assets to cover his debts before the auditors arrive on Monday." "But if you're sane," I whispered, stepping closer, "why not just tell them? Why play this game? You could call the police. You could call a lawyer." "I have no access," Arthur said, his face hardening. "Vance controls the phone lines in this wing. My cell phone disappeared the day I was admitted. Richard has power of attorney over my health care. If I scream, 'I'm sane,' Vance simply increases the dose, marks it down as aggressive delirium. And I wake up 3 days later tied to a bed, drooling on myself, with my signature already forged or coerced. No. I needed them to believe I was gone. I needed them to get sloppy." He gestured for me to come to the side of the bed. "They think I'm a vegetable, so they talk in front of me. Richard and Vance. They discuss the bribes. They discuss the falsified neurological reports. They discuss the offshore accounts where they're hiding the skimmed money." He tapped the notebook. "I have dates, times, account numbers, quotes. I have everything." That's incredible," I breathed. "We can take this to the police." "Not yet," Arthur cut in sharply. "It's my word against a renowned neurologist and a beloved philanthropist's son. A notebook written by a dementia patient is easily dismissed as paranoid scribbles. I need undeniable proof. And tomorrow is the only chance I'll ever get." Arthur reached under the neckline of his hospital gown. For a moment, I thought he was having chest pain, but he was fumbling with something taped to his chest, right over his heart. He grimaced as he pulled a strip of medical tape away from his skin. In his hand, he held a small, flat object. It wasn't a locket, and it wasn't a key. It was a micro SD card, no bigger than a fingernail. "This," he said, holding it up to the moonlight, is the insurance policy. I stared at the tiny chip. What is it? Before they took my phone, I managed to record the intake interview. The one where Richard told Vance, "I don't care what you have to inject him with. Just make sure he's incompetent by the time the board meets." It's all there. But there's more. He looked at me, his expression softening for the first time into something paternal and desperate. "I never told anyone this before, not even my late wife. But Richard, he isn't the only one after the money. There is a third partner, someone inside this facility, someone you trust." My stomach dropped. "Who?" "Mrs. Gable, the night supervisor," Arthur whispered. "She's the one who swaps the logs. She's the one who ensures no other nurse stays in this room too long. That's why she was so happy to let you stay tonight. She thinks you're incompetent, Elena. She thinks you're too young and naive to notice anything. She told Vance yesterday, 'Don't worry about the new girl. She doesn't see what's right in front of her face.' I felt a flush of anger and humiliation. They thought I was stupid. They thought I was just a piece of furniture. That anger solidified my resolve more than any pity ever could. "I need you to take this," Arthur said, pressing the SD card into my hand. It was warm from his skin. "If they succeed tomorrow, if they force the signature and then decide I'm too much of a liability to keep alive, you need to get this to the district attorney, not the police, the DA. I have a name written in the notebook." "I'm not leaving you," I said firmly. "I'm working the morning shift. I'll be here." "They won't let you in the room," Arthur warned. "They'll bring their own witness, a notary on their payroll." "Then I'll find a way," I promised. "But what are you going to do?" Arthur lay back against the pillow, the steel returning to his eyes. A small, terrifying smile played on his lips. "I'm going to give the performance of a lifetime. I'm going to make them believe they've won. I need Richard to feel safe. I need him to lean in close. Because when he does, I'm going to take something from him." He didn't explain what he meant. He just closed his eyes and whispered, "Hide the card, Elena. And for God's sake, don't let Mrs. Gable see you leaving this room." I left the room with the SD card tucked inside my bra, my heart pounding a rhythm of fear and adrenaline. I felt like a spy in enemy territory. Every shadow in the hallway looked like Mrs. Gable. Every beep of a monitor sounded like an alarm. I managed to slip out without being seen, but I didn't go home. I sat in my car in the parking lot, watching the window of room 304, clutching the tiny piece of plastic that held a man's life and a family's dark secrets. The next morning, the atmosphere in the nursing home was suffocating. The rain had stopped, but the sky was a bruised purple, heavy and oppressive. When I clocked in at 7 a.m., the tension was palpable. Dr. Vance was already at the nurse's station, wearing a crisp navy suit instead of his usual white coat. He looked like a businessman, not a healer. Mrs. Gable was hovering near him, whispering efficiently. When she saw me, her eyes narrowed. "Elena," Vance called out, his voice jovial but his eyes cold. "Good morning. We have a VIP situation in room 304 today. Mr. Sterling's family is here for a sensitive legal proceeding. I'm assigning you to the West Wing for the morning. Mrs. Gable will handle 304. It was exactly as Arthur had predicted. They were cutting me out. "Understood, doctor," I said, forcing a smile that felt like it was cracking my face. "I'll just grab my stethoscope from the break room." I didn't go to the West Wing. I went to the supply closet adjacent to room 304. It shared a ventilation duct. It was an old trick I'd learned during my first year when I wanted to hear gossip from the break room. I climbed up on a stack of adult diaper boxes and pressed my ear against the vent. The sound was tinny, but audible. At 9 a.m. sharp, I heard the heavy footsteps. 3 men. I recognized Richard's voice immediately. Arrogant, loud, impatient. "Let's get this over with, Vance. I have a flight to Zurich at noon." "He's prepped," Vance's voice floated through the vent. "He's been heavily sedated since last night. He shouldn't be able to form a coherent sentence, let alone read the document. He'll just scribble where you point, Good, a third voice said. Scratchy, deep. The lawyer. The trust transfer requires a lucid interval clause, which I've already drafted. We just need the mark. I heard the door to room 304 open. I held my breath. I could imagine the scene. Arthur lying there, limp, eyes unfocused, drool on his chin. The perfect victim. "Hello, Father," Richard said. There was no warmth in it, just contempt. "Look at him. God, it's pathetic. To think this man used to terrify the market." "Let's proceed," the lawyer said. "Mr. Sterling? Arthur? Can you hear me?" Silence. Then a low moan from Arthur. Water?" A perfect broken wheeze. "He's thirsty," Vance said. "Ignore it. Get the pen in his hand." I heard the rustle of papers. "Put the pen here, Father," Richard ordered. "Right here on the line. Just make an X. That's all we need. Then you can go back to sleep. Forever." No, Arthur mumbled, sounding distressed. "Grab his hand, Vance," Richard snapped. "Force it if you have to." My hands were clenched into fists. I wanted to burst out of the closet, scream, call the police. But I remembered Arthur's plan. Wait for the moment. "Stop fighting, old man." Richard's voice raised. I heard a scuffle. The sound of a metal bed rail rattling. "You're signing this away. You're done. Your history. Rich. Ard." Arthur's voice was weak, pleading. "Shut up and sign," Richard yelled. "You owe me this. You always loved the company more than you loved me." "Well, now the company is mine." Then, silence. A heavy, pregnant pause that lasted for 3 seconds. And then, a voice I recognized. But it wasn't the weak, dementia-riddled voice of the last 6 months. It was the voice from the night before. Clear, sharp, dangerous. "You're wrong, Richard," Arthur said. The audio through the vent was crystal clear. The sudden shift in tone must have been like a bomb going off in that room. I didn't love the company more. I just loved it enough to keep it away from a thief like you. "What?" Richard stammered. "Vance, what is this? You said he was sedated." I don't know," Vance stuttered. "He took the pills. I saw the logs." "He didn't take anything." Arthur's voice boomed now, gaining strength. "And neither did you, Richard, if you think you're walking out of here with my assets." I heard movement, violent, sudden movement. A chair scraping against the floor. "Get the needle," Richard screamed. "Sedate him, now!" "Don't touch me," Arthur shouted. I couldn't wait in the closet anymore. The plan was falling apart. They were going to hurt him. I kicked the door of the supply closet open and sprinted into the hallway. Mrs. Gable was standing guard by the door, her eyes widening in shock as she saw me. "You can't go in there," she hissed, stepping in front of me. "Move!" I yelled, adrenaline surging through my veins. I shoved her aside, harder than I intended, and she stumbled back against the crash cart. I grabbed the handle of room 304 and threw the door open. The scene inside was chaotic. "Doctor..." Vance was grappling with Arthur, trying to pin his arms down. The lawyer was backing away into a corner, clutching his briefcase. And Richard was standing over his father, a syringe in his hand that he must have grabbed from the emergency tray, his face twisted in a mask of pure, murderous rage. Arthur wasn't cowering. He was fighting. He had one hand clamped around Vance's wrist, twisting it with surprising strength. But Richard was raising the syringe, aiming for Arthur's neck. "Stop!" I screamed, stepping into the room. "The police are on their way." It was a lie, but it froze them for a second. Richard turned to me, the syringe still raised. His eyes were wild. "You!" he spat. "The nurse. I told you to get rid of her, Vance." She's nobody," Vance panted, struggling to hold Arthur down. "I'm the witness," I said, my voice trembling but loud. I pulled my phone out, another bluff I hadn't dialed yet. "And I have everything recorded. The pills, the threats, the fraud. Richard looked at me, then at his father. He realized the situation was spiraling. He made a decision. He dropped the syringe and lunged, not at Arthur, but at the table where the documents lay. He grabbed the papers. "This isn't over," Richard yelled. "He's incompetent. Anything he says is inadmissible." But Arthur wasn't done. With Vance distracted by me, Arthur surged upward, breaking the doctor's grip. He didn't reach for Richard. He reached for the bedside table, grabbing the heavy metal pitcher of water. "Richard!" Arthur barked. Richard turned. Arthur swung the pitcher with all the force of a man who had been storing up rage for 6 months. It didn't hit Richard. It smashed into the large antique mirror on the wall behind him. Crash. Shards of glass exploded outward, raining down on the room. The violence of the act stunned everyone into silence. Breathing heavily, standing on the bed like a vengeful patriarch, Arthur pointed a shaking finger at his son. "Look at the mirror, Richard," Arthur snarled. "Look at what you've become, and then look behind it." We all looked. Behind the shattered glass of the mirror, embedded in the wall, was a small black circle. A lens. "I didn't just record the audio," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a terrifying calm. "I had a private security team install that camera 3 years ago when I first bought this facility. I own this building, you idiot. I own the nursing home. I own the ground you're standing on. And this entire meeting has been live-streamed to the board of directors." Richard's face went white. The papers slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the floor. Dr. Vance slowly let go of the bed rail, backing away with his hands up. I was just following orders. Clinical protocol." "It's too late for that, doctor," Arthur said, smoothing his hospital gown with dignified precision. He looked at me, and for the first time in months, he smiled, a genuine warm smile. "Elena, would you be so kind as to call the authorities now? I believe we have some trespassers." I stared at him, my mouth agape. The twist wasn't just the recorder. It wasn't just the sanity. It was the ownership. He hadn't just been hiding. He had been trapping them in his own house. But as I reached for my phone, Richard's shock turned into desperation. He looked at the open window, then at me, then at his father. "You ruin everything!" he screamed, and instead of fleeing, he lunged at Arthur one last time, his hands reaching for the old man's throat. "No!" I dove forward, throwing myself between the son and the father. The impact was brutal. I collided with Richard mid-air, my shoulder slamming into his chest. We both crashed onto the hard linoleum floor, a tangle of limbs and shouting. He was younger, stronger, and fueled by a desperate animalistic panic. His hands were clawing at me, trying to shove me aside to get to his father. I felt his fingernails dig into my arm, stinging like fire. "Get off me," he screamed, spit flying from his mouth. "He ruined my life. He ruined everything." I struggled to hold him back, but I was losing. I saw Dr. Vance frozen near the door, too cowardly to help, too terrified to run. Richard raised a fist, ready to strike me, ready to clear his path to the old man who had outsmarted him. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the blow. But it never came. There was a dull thud, and Richard's weight suddenly became dead weight. He slumped over me, groaning. I pushed him off and scrambled backward, gasping for air. Arthur was standing over his son, the heavy metal base of his bedside lamp in his hand. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving, but he stood tall. He hadn't just watched. He had protected me. The frail invalid had just taken down a man half his age. "That," Arthur said, his voice trembling with a mix of adrenaline and profound sorrow, "is enough." Before Richard could recover, the room was suddenly flooded with noise. The door was kicked fully open, not by the nursing home security, but by men in dark, tactical suits. Police officers swarmed in behind them. "Police! Nobody move! Hands where we can see them!" It was chaos. Dr. Vance was tackled to the ground before he could even utter a protest. Richard, groggy and bleeding from a cut on his forehead, was hauled to his feet and slammed against the wall, handcuffs clicking shut around his wrists. The lawyer dropped his briefcase and raised his shaking hands in surrender. I sat on the floor, leaning against the bed frame, watching the scene unfold like a movie. But my eyes were fixed on Arthur. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look like a winner. He looked like a man watching his own heart being ripped out. He walked over to where the police were holding Richard. "Father," Richard wept, the arrogance completely gone, replaced by a pathetic, whining child. "Father, please. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them I was worried about you. Please. I'm your son." Arthur looked at him. For a long moment, the room went silent. The officers waited. I waited. This was the moment for the anger, for the "I told you so." But Arthur just shook his head slowly. "No, Richard," he said softly. "You stopped being my son the day you decided my life was worth less than your debt. I gave you 6 months. 6 months to visit. 6 months to ask how I was. 6 months to bring me a flower, a card, a kind word. Instead, you brought a lawyer and a syringe. I can change." Richard sobbed as they dragged him toward the door. "I can change, Dad." "People don't change, Richard," Arthur whispered, tears finally spilling over his wrinkled cheeks. "They just reveal who they really are." As they took Richard away, Arthur slumped back onto the bed, the energy draining out of him instantly. He looked at me. "Are you hurt, Elena?" "I'm fine," I said, wiping a smear of blood from my arm. "Not mine, Richard's." "But, Arthur, you said you owned the building. You said the board was watching. Was that true?" Arthur sighed and reached for the glass of water on the nightstand, the one he hadn't smashed. He took a sip, his hand shaking. "Partially. I don't own the building, Elena. I sold the building 3 years ago to a holding company." He looked at me with a mischievous glint returning to his wet eyes. "But I own the holding company." He gestured to the shattered mirror. "And the board?" There was no board watching. The live stream was going to one person. "Who?" I asked. "The district attorney," Arthur revealed. "He's an old friend from my days at the club. I told him I suspected foul play. He told me he needed evidence, real evidence. So I gave him the best seat in the house. The revelation hit me hard. This hadn't just been a plan. It had been a high-wire act without a net. If the DA hadn't been watching, or if the police had been a minute later, Arthur would be dead, and I would have been collateral damage. "Why?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Why go to such extremes? Why not just cut him out of the will?" Arthur looked out the window, where the rain clouds were finally breaking, letting a shaft of sunlight hit the wet pavement below. "Because I needed to know," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of a father's grief. "A will is just paper. It can be contested. It can be fought. But I needed to know in my soul if there was anything left in him worth saving. I hid the pills. I faked the dementia. I endured the humiliation of being treated like an infant, all to give him a chance. Every time he came in here, I prayed. Just hold my hand, Richard. Just ask if I'm in pain. If he had done that, just once, I would have given him everything. I would have forgiven the debts. I would have saved him." He turned back to me, and the tragedy of his victory was clear. He failed the test, Elena. He didn't want a father. He wanted a bank account. 2 weeks later, the scandal was still front-page news. "The tycoon who played dead," the headlines screamed. Dr. Vance was facing 15 years for malpractice and fraud. Mrs. Gable had turned state's witness to save her own skin. Richard was being held without bail, charged with attempted murder and elder abuse. The Sterling Empire was in chaos, but it was a cleansing chaos. I hadn't been back to the nursing home. I had resigned the same day. I couldn't walk those halls anymore without seeing the ghosts of what had happened. I was sitting in my small apartment, scrolling through job listings, wondering if any other hospital would hire a nurse who had technically assaulted a patient's son and falsified medical logs, even if it was for the right reason. There was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a man in a chauffeur's uniform holding a thick envelope. "Miss Elena?" he asked. "Mr. Sterling requested I hand-deliver this to you." I took the envelope. It was heavy, made of expensive cream-colored paper. My heart hammered. Was it a lawsuit? A subpoena? I opened it. Inside, there was a letter, handwritten in elegant, steady cursive. No shakes, no tremors, and a set of keys. "Dear Elena," the letter began. "They say that in our final years we become invisible. We become furniture in the lives of the young. But you saw me. You didn't see a checkbook, and you didn't see a burden. You saw a man. You risked your career, your safety, and your future to protect a stranger who couldn't protect himself. I am dismantling the Sterling Trust. The money that poisoned my son will not poison anyone else. Most of it is going to charities for elder abuse prevention. However, I have one final business venture I wish to pursue. I am purchasing the nursing home. Yes, the one you hated. I'm firing the board, renovating the facility, and changing the name. It will be a place where dignity is the only currency that matters. But a ship needs a captain. The keys in this envelope are not for a car. They are for the executive director's office. I don't need a doctor to run it. I need a human being. I need someone who knows that medicine is useless without compassion. The job is yours if you want it. And if you don't, well, check the glove compartment of the car waiting outside. There's a severance package that will ensure you never have to change a bedpan again unless you choose to. Your friend, Arthur. I walked to the window. Down on the street, a sleek black car was waiting. In the back seat, the window rolled down. Arthur was there. He was wearing a sharp gray suit, sunglasses, and he looked 10 years younger. He looked up at my window and gave me a small, sharp salute. I looked at the keys in my hand. Then I looked at the help wanted ads on my laptop screen. I closed the laptop. I walked downstairs, not as a nurse who had lost her way, but as a woman who had found her purpose. I got into the car, and Arthur smiled. "Ready to get to work, Director?" he asked. "Ready," I said, smiling back. As the car pulled away, merging into the traffic of the city, I realized something profound. We spend our lives fearing the end, fearing the silence, fearing the moment we become dependent. But Arthur had taught me that as long as you have your mind, and as long as you have the truth, you are never powerless. He had hidden his pills to save his mind, but in the end, he had used his mind to save us both. Sometimes, the quietest people in the room are the ones screaming the loudest. You just have to be willing to listen.